Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Billi.
I'm Emma.
There have been several anti-Semitic attacks in Sydney in the past 3 months, which has led to governments and police, as well as leaders of other faiths, uniting to condemn, investigate and press charges against those responsible. This week, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced a national database to track anti-Semitic crime following a meeting with the National Cabinet. At the same time, the Australian Federal Police has announced it is investigating if overseas actors or individuals have paid local criminals in Australia to carry out some of these crimes in our suburbs. We'll tell you what you need to know in today's podcast.
Billi, like you said, there have been several anti-Semitic attacks in Sydney, even in Melbourne in recent months. We've seen a real increase in these kinds of hate crimes. It's moved into a national conversation now, which we're going to unpack today. But what's the latest on these attacks? There was more this week. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so on Tuesday, just before 1 a.m, so overnight, emergency services were called to a childcare centre in Maroubra. Now, for those not familiar, Maroubra is a suburb in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, which is where many of these anti-Semitic attacks have taken place, and the eastern suburbs is also where a lot of Sydney's Jewish population live. Now, the childcare centre was near a synagogue and it was lit on fire, and the centre's walls also had anti-Semitic graffiti spray painted on. And police have said that, of course, there was a fire, there was extensive damage to the building, and that childcare centre remains closed today.
And that childcare centre, I think it's important to add, is a non-denominational centre. It was not a Jewish childcare centre, it was not a particular religious centre. It just happened to be located next to a synagogue.
Exactly. And an investigation into who is responsible for that attack is now underway by New South Wales Police. After this happened in the morning of Tuesday, New South Wales Premier FitzSimons held a press conference saying these anti-Semitic attacks are the opposite of the kind of country that we all want to live in. And he was standing next to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese during that press conference, who also added, "This is a place for children and families, and it should never have been denigrated by this despicable and horrifying crime." And like we've mentioned, Emma, this was the latest in a string of attacks. This was not an isolated incident. There have been 8 similar attacks on buildings and cars in Sydney in the past 3 months.
You've mentioned there is this ongoing investigation by police into that attack on the daycare centre. Where are police up to overall with these string of offences?
Yeah, so there are multiple different, they call them operations or strike forces that have been set up both at the New South Wales Police Force level and then also at the Australian Federal Police level. I'll go through New South Wales Police first. So they have set up Strike Force Pearl last December to investigate these anti-Semitic attacks. Since then, 9 people have been charged, and that includes one person who was charged yesterday for allegedly setting fire to a synagogue in Newtown, which is also a suburb in Sydney, and that happened earlier this month. Now, that person appeared in court yesterday and was denied bail. And then at the federal police level, the AFP, they also set up an operation in December to investigate anti-Semitism. And since that operation was established, there have been 166 reports of anti-Semitism, with 15 under investigation and 1 person arrested.
We did hear from New South Wales Premier FitzSimons this week. He had very strong language in his condemnation of this daycare attack, and he gave us a bit of an update on those charges and investigations, as you mentioned, and several of the people arrested across the board have been refused bail, and he seems to be wanting to make it very clear that investigators are taking this very seriously.
Yeah, police and government officials have both said multiple times that the perpetrators of these crimes will face the full force of the law. That is a phrase that we have heard a lot when talking about these crimes. And like I mentioned before, this is certainly not an issue that is just isolated to New South Wales even. There have also been arrests in Victoria, but certainly most of the recent attacks have been in Sydney.
And so this kind of all culminated in this announcement on Tuesday that there would be a snap National Cabinet meeting. National Cabinet was convened. What do we know about that meeting? What came from it?
Yeah, for anyone not familiar with National Cabinet, it is a meeting of all of the state and territory leaders. The name is kind of confusing because it is separate to the government's cabinet, which is the federal government's most senior ministers. So there's that government cabinet. And then separate to that, there is this meeting with the leaders of the state and territory governments and also the Prime Minister. And this is when the Prime Minister and, of course, the leaders of the states and territories get together to discuss a matter of significant concern to the nation. And it was actually first organised in the early days of the COVID pandemic, and it's been called kind of periodically ever since whenever there is a nationwide issue that leaders want to address together.
I can remember one of the more recent National Cabinet meetings being about addressing the domestic violence crisis in the country as an example of what kind of the threshold is for National Cabinet to be assembled.
Yeah, exactly. And I always find it surprising that they didn't have this prior to the pandemic.
Yeah.
It feels like a really necessary thing for them to have. So back to this, on Tuesday, the Prime Minister called this meeting. And what came from that is the announcement that there will be a new national database to better inform and coordinate responses to anti-Semitic incidents. Now, this is on top of a number of previous announcements the federal government has made over the past few months, mostly around increased funding for police and security around Jewish institutions. Now, in terms of this announcement on Tuesday, there wasn't really that much detail provided beyond the fact that there will be this new database, but my understanding is that it will be similar to how last year the government announced a national database for domestic violence, which was also done to, bring together all of the data of each individual state and territory in one place. And the idea is that that database can then help inform new policies, and it can also help law enforcement develop the most effective measures to combat the issue. So there is kind of precedence around having this one national database for a significant issue.
And it can be confusing, and often trends are missed when police at a state level are dealing with their own investigations, and it's not until we kind of zoom out nationally that you can start to connect the dots. So at the same time as National Cabinet convened to come to announce this database, the AFP also announced, and that's the Australian Federal Police, it also announced that it was looking into whether overseas actors could be involved in these attacks. And I think this is a really interesting part of the story, and perhaps a headline we weren't expecting. Billi, what are we talking about when we say overseas actors?
Hi, I'm Ola.
And I'm Elliot.
We're the two-person team behind everything video and audio here at the Daily Aus.
If you want to help us grow so we can deliver more of the content that you love, be sure to hit subscribe.
Now let's get back to the video.
So we don't know too much detail. I would say that they did keep their cards quite close to their chest, but basically what they said is they're investigating whether individuals or potentially groups are coordinating these attacks and potentially paying people in Australia to carry out these anti-Semitic attacks.
So groups or individuals overseas potentially coordinating with people here on the ground in Australia. So they're investigating the idea that these attacks might not just be within the Australian community, but there's something more sinister internationally at play.
Exactly. And they said that one line of inquiry they're looking at is if young people are being intentionally radicalized online by these potential overseas actors and then being encouraged to commit anti-Semitic attacks. They're also looking into how possible payment could have been made, including if cryptocurrency has been used.
Wow, that's so interesting because, of course, we're talking more and hearing more and more about online extremism, radicalization, but I think sometimes that feels like a really faraway concept. So to hear in real time how a national investigation might be looking into the use of that radicalization online playing out in this way is really concerning, of course, but so interesting.
Yeah, it kind of speaks to this new age of crime that we are clearly in, and how the internet and different types of evolving technologies are being weaponized to carry out crime. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese also commented on this yesterday. He said that he was reluctant to provide too much detail out of concern that it could compromise their investigations, but he said that it would appear that some of these attacks are being perpetrated by people, and this is a quote, who don't have a particular issue, aren't motivated by an ideology, but are paid actors. Again, they haven't confirmed that. That is just a line of investigation, but that is what they've told us is where they're focusing their energy at the moment.
So we've seen this spate of anti-Semitic attacks, a rise in anti-Semitism across the country in recent months. But Sydney's also dealt with increased Islamophobia. Is that right?
Yeah, and this is also really important to mention. So at the same time as police conduct investigations into these anti-Semitic attacks, they are also investigating a recent incident in Wiley Park, which is a suburb of southwestern Sydney. So on the 17th of January last week, at a supermarket that stocks Lebanese groceries, a wall was vandalised with Islamophobic graffiti, and those investigations into that incident are still ongoing. And that was also not an isolated incident. There has been other Islamophobic graffiti that has been spray painted in Sydney. For example, last December, police investigated Islamophobic graffiti in Chester Hill. So like you said, Emma, Sydney has also dealt with Islamophobia, and there has been this wave of religious hate crime, and it has seen religious leaders from many faiths come together to condemn all religiously motivated hate crimes.
With this concern around an increase in these hate crimes, religiously motivated, racially motivated, how has the federal government responded at a community level?
Yeah, so last year the federal government announced 2 new appointments, the special envoy roles. Now, a special envoy is someone who advises the government on a particular area and advocates for a specific cause or group of people. So in July last year, lawyer Gillian Segal was announced as Australia's first special envoy to combat antisemitism. At the time, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said Segal's role is designed to help Jewish Australians feel safe and included in response to rising anti-Semitism since the Israel-Hamas war began. And then in September, Aftab Malik was announced as the special envoy to combat Islamophobia in Australia. Now, Malik, who worked in the New South Wales Premier's department for over a decade, said he doesn't intend to, quote, advocate that one form of hatred is more important than another. Both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are unacceptable. Both appointments will serve 3-year terms and report to the PM.
Billi, thank you so much for breaking that down for us today and explaining everything that's going on in Sydney, around Australia. Of course, this is a story that is seemingly evolving by the day. We will continue to keep you guys updated, whatever comes next, and especially as we hear more from National Cabinet on this one. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of The Daily Aus. If you learned something, please feel free to share it with a friend, and don't forget to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening to The Daily Aus, or if you're watching us over on YouTube. We will be back later on today with your evening headlines. Until then, have a good day.